Hello, it's Eric Strong from Stanford University and Strong Medicine. I know I've been talking a lot about AI over the last 6 months on here, but I could not pass up the opportunity to talk about some of my own research on this, which was just published yesterday in JAMA Internal Medicine. Back in January, I released a teaser on this in which I gave one of my med school exams to ChatGPT one time, and then I graded the results according to the same rubric that we use with our own students. If you haven't seen it, that's okay. The link is in the video description. But in short, the bot would have just barely passed the exam. Based on this proof of concept, a group of my colleagues and I undertook an analysis in order to much more robustly answer the question, how does ChatGPT's performance compare to our own students at Stanford Medical School on long-form, free response clinical reasoning exams that simulate real-life cases? This video will have three parts to it. First, how did this work go beyond what's already been done before? For example, with ChatGPT or MedPalm passing multiple choice exams in the style of the US medical licensing exam, which to date has gotten a disproportionately large share of attention. Second, I'll talk about what our results were. And last, I'll be pulling in three of my co-authors for a discussion on what this finding means for the future of medical education, and maybe to some extent for the future of medicine more generally. To begin, what specific skills do these exams assess, and what does the exam format look like? There are other videos on the channel which go into much more depth on what clinical reasoning is, but very briefly, clinical reasoning is the collection of cognitive processes which a clinician uses to analyze a patient's symptoms and exam findings in order to hypothesize possible diagnoses and select appropriate confirmatory tests, interpret those test results, refine hypotheses, and ultimately recommend treatment options. It involves book knowledge of science. It involves familiarity with the medical literature, the qualitative application of biostatistics, a consideration of the cost and risks from both tests and treatments, and in the end, it involves also an integration of the patient's values and preferences. It is a complex, multifaceted, and patient-centered discipline which every practicing clinician does on a routine basis. One of the more common ways we test clinical reasoning skills in students is to have them analyze written or videotaped cases designed to have a degree of complexity and ambiguity appropriate for their stage of training. In a typical exam, the student is provided information in increments, asked about the possible diagnoses at various points, and they're given other clinically oriented tasks, such as concisely summarizing the case or crafting a formal problem list for the patient. Because of the subjectivity and uncertainty inherent to the topic, it's necessary to create an objective, predetermined grading rubric for each question. For example, if a question asked for the top 4 most likely diagnoses for a clinical vignette, there might be 6 or 8 diagnoses which receive full credit, and maybe another 6 or 8 which receive partial credit. As another example, if a question asked a student to concisely summarize a case, the student might get a point for each centrally relevant feature that's included, and have a point deducted for each time they included a piece of information that was not centrally relevant. You may already be thinking about differences between this style of exam and the USMLE, or United States Medical Licensing Exam, that the press and folks on social media got excited to hear was passed by chatbots. Let me specifically demonstrate the differences and talk about why performing well on our clinical reasoning exams would be much more notable. So here's an example of a typical USMLE Step 1 style question. Feel free to pause the video and read it through. The first thing to note is that it's relatively short. The question stem consists of a clinical vignette of less than 100 words. This is followed by a brief multiple choice question with 4 succinct answer choices. To correctly answer this particular question requires recalling and drawing a connection between 2 pieces of related factual information. The most common cause of a normal INR and elevated PTT in a minimally symptomatic patient, and the most common coagulation factor deficiency seen in this disease. For a human taking a closed book exam, This is difficult because of how much medical information that the human needs to be able to remember. But for a bot trained on the entire internet, this task feels similar to taking someone with no medical training whatsoever, giving them access to the web, and seeing if they could answer it. USMLE questions contain almost no extraneous information and virtually never contain directly contradictory information. The answer choices contain one and only one correct answer. Yet in the actual practice of medicine, most information you have about a patient is not directly relevant to the question at hand. There is almost always some piece of data that is inconsistent with the bigger picture, and there may be more than one right answer to a clinical question. So let's compare the USMLE style questions with those in our clinical reasoning exams, which do mimic real life much more closely. So here is what a typical one might look like. The first question is nice and short. It's asking for the test taker to provide what's called a diagnostic framework or diagnostic schema for acute headache. This question is admittedly pure information recall in the sense that the test taker could easily provide a table or a chart that was memorized from a book or a lecture. But then look at the second question. A 650-word vignette, which includes plenty of details that are not relevant, and even details that might be seen as contradicting one another. As just one example, the patient reports no fever on history, but is then found to be febrile on exam. And then the test taker is given the very open-ended task of providing the top 3 diagnostic possibilities, along with a justification for each. To be perfectly frank, this is not something one can look up online via a conventional search engine. You need a non-trivial amount of medical knowledge just to sift through the 650 words to identify what's likely to be relevant, and a non-trivial amount of knowledge even to select proper search terms. Follow-up questions include one on the interpretation of specific test results in the context of the patient's history and exam findings, as well as one asking for a prioritized and accurately organized problem list, which is a formal structure within a patient's medical record. Again, these are not questions that one can answer via a simple web search. So now, what specifically did we do, and what did we find? We selected 14 clinical cases from our clinical reasoning final exams given to our first and second year students between 2019 and 2022. Each case consisted of discrete sequential passages separated by 2 to 7 free response questions. Each case was run through the GPT 3.5 and GPT 4 versions of ChatGPT twice each, with only very modest prompt engineering. 2 faculty independently graded responses according to the same rubrics that had been used with our students. Passing threshold was predetermined to be 70%, which is what we use in our course. And then we compared the performance of the 2 versions of the chatbot against our actual students' historical performance. What did we find? First, GPT-4 absolutely crushed GPT 3.5. But more importantly, the performance of GPT-4 was statistically superior to our own students. GPT-4 received an average score of 86.4% compared to the students' average of 82.2%, with a p-value of 0.02. When examining questions by the specific skills they were assessing, GPT-4 vastly outperformed our students in constructing a problem list, while there were no specific skills in which students outperformed GPT-4. So in summary, the latest version of ChatGPT outperforms Stanford Medical Students on their free response clinical reasoning final exams. And with that, I'm going to bring in 3 of my co-authors to discuss what this means for medical education and medicine more broadly. So here I am. I'm joined by 3 of my co-authors on this paper, and we're going to talk a little bit about sort of what we learned from it and what we think the implications are for the future of medical education and maybe even a little bit beyond that. So maybe each of you could introduce yourselves.
Hey everybody, I'm Jonathan Chen. I'm an assistant professor at the Stanford Center for Biomedical Informatics Research. I also practice clinically in hospital medicine.
Yeah, hi, I'm Alicia DiGiammarino, and I am the education manager for the second year practice of medicine course at Stanford.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Hom. I'm a clinical associate professor within the Division of Hospital Medicine and the course director for the second year practice of medicine course.
All right. So let's get started. So we all worked on this paper. It took a while to, it took a little bit longer than I initially thought when I was starting off, especially with all of the bouncing around with peer review and getting not getting getting scooped by GPT 3.5, switching up to 4 mid review, which was sort of an unfortunate monkey wrench in the process.
I mean, we certainly have to tell that story, right? I mean, what I thought what was so exciting, when ChatGPT first came out, late last year, and then it's like, oh, I should test this on USMLE multiple choice questions, but I'm not going to do that because it's such the obvious thing to do. I know there's 10 people doing that already. But then I saw you guys got so energized. You got much more complex, a real test you give medical students. And we all jumped on it because we knew we had to jump on this fast. It's moving like lightning speed. And I think we were all up late. We had multiple late night calls making it happen. And we scrambled. I think we had it done by the end of February. Who made it? Submitted. Their journal's totally into it. They're giving us feedback, last level line edits. And then what happens? End of March, GPT-4 release. And the editor says, hey, sorry, guys, your study is now obsolete. Oh, like, this is like maybe true, but it really was telling the pace of the technology and what we're working with here.
Yeah, I think if we were like 1 week faster, I think they would have accepted it before GPT-4 was integrated into ChatGPT. So anyway, I thought we were really fast on it. I guess just not quite fast enough.
I saw this commentary that the humans can adapt to things at a linear time pace, but technology can move at an exponential pace. So even I think we did move really fast. So that was amazing how quickly we got a team together and graded all this. But the technology can sometimes move even faster than you can. The reality is that they had it in the pipe for months and they were just like holding on to it to release it suddenly. But nonetheless, it was surprising and really puts a perspective on where we are and like where are we going into the future that I guess really great to hear whatever perspective is on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, we saw that GPT-4, when ChatGPT running on GPT-4 runs much better, at least, on the tasks that I think in general it does. I mean, I think anecdotally it's much better over 3.5, but certainly for the tasks of answering our clinical reasoning exams, it did much better. Were you guys surprised by that? In terms of how much better 4 was over 3.5?
Yeah, I found it really remarkable. I mean, just looking at some of the questions that it struggled on initially with the prior version and sometimes gave like completely erroneous responses. And then looking at the latest version, it just such markedly improved answers in such a short period of time. Just hard to believe.
I think my jaw kind of dropped when I was getting the grades coming back in, and I thought we had a kind of cool study, and then when these grades came in, I was like, oh, this is a very cool study.
Yeah, well, maybe it was actually good that we got
right.
delayed and had to rework the entire thing almost from scratch. When we did just the first set of results with 3.5, I wasn't where I mean, it was kind of interesting. It was kind of cool, Alicia, as you were saying, but I didn't feel like it was going to like totally shake up medical education at that moment. And then GPT-4 came out, we ran everything again from scratch, and we saw how well it did. And we saw that in some ways, it sort of outperformed our students, just by small degrees. Was that surprising that it did that much better? I mean, not just that the improvement, but just like the technology's at this point now where it outperforms first and second year students. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think totally agree. And the fact that it's outperforming students and providing responses within a few seconds, then many students are taking much longer orders and actually longer to do. I mean, that's quite impressive in terms of efficiency or potential efficiency.
I had referenced before how I had computer science students working on this type of problem, in 2019. Oh, new transformer technology. Let's test this out on answering medical questions. It seems to be like this cool new technology. Let's see how it does. And it was getting like 35% accuracy on board style exam questions at the time. So that's an interesting toy, but that's useless for anything really practical. So that's even when GPT 3.5 was emerging, I was like, wow, that is a huge leap than what I saw just a few years ago. So actually that projecting forward, GPT-4 is like surprising, but actually it's not surprising because, wow, you can see the trajectory of the pace at which things are moving along.
Do you have a sense of whether or not, like, is GPT 4.5 coming out? Is GPT 5 coming out? Like where's this going from here? Are we going to see sort of incremental improvements the way we saw from 3.5 to 4? Or is there actually some ceiling beyond which this approach to AI is like it's going to hit the ceiling and then we can't get any better than this unless we completely change sort of from a coding perspective how we are looking at these kinds of tasks?
I mean, it's active debate, research, and speculation at this point about whether this approach is already doing pretty darn incredible things, but there's a certain limit it's going to reach, right? It just doesn't have a model of the world, doesn't understand certain things. And also we have to speculate because they won't release the actual information. When is your GPT-4? Most people assume it's 1 trillion parameters. According to leaked information, it probably costs $60 million just to train it. So the next version should be 10x bigger. Now you're talking about, $1 billion to train something. Eventually the internet runs out just in terms of having a data source to train on. So it seems like the field from a computational point of shifting, not to trying to make the system much better, because maybe that starts to saturate, but can we get systems that work almost as well, but that are way more efficient, doesn't require this gigantic engineering infrastructure? They've proven it's possible. Okay, now make it practical so we can use it in different ways. But speculation at this point. I don't know what Alicia others think, but does that even just scare you? Thought of like, we're learning from the internet. That all sounds good, right? Or does it? What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think that sounds scary. I think that gets at sort of some of the ethical issues that come up when you start talking about using this type of technology in medicine, especially. Yeah, and learning from the internet and what is really the content that you're learning from, and is it biased, and is it transparent, like how the AI made the decision that it made? Like, to me, it's not. I don't have any idea.
I'm pretty sure it's not transparent to anybody. Like, I don't know if even the folks that designed it can tell you for an individual decision, like how it decided to include X piece of data instead of Y piece of data.
One of the things I did when I first got my hands on it was I was trying to break it, right? I was trying to make it say some really nasty bias thing or some toxic thing. So I asked it all sorts of really nasty medical scenarios. Let's just see how it says it, because I was trying to catch it. And, I came up with a case, patient with dementia, and now they're aspirating and the family's insisting on a feeding tube. This is a very tense ethical situation. And interestingly, it turned out that was a very useful practice for me, because it came up with some pretty decent responses, and it allowed me to practice a high stakes conversation in a low stakes setting. That it emerged other ways you can use these technologies in ways that aren't just the obvious question answering, was what we want to test it and evaluate it on. But the implications of it, I think, reach even further beyond. And it was just such an important thing that we even got this study out to put a milestone on what it can do.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because it highlights what you just bring up, Jonathan, is like this technology. Like, I think our first thought is, in medical educators, is you hear about ChatGPT, you're like, oh my gosh, our students going to be using this for their assessments. They're going to be, I mean, I've heard a lot of people worried that, are they going to use this to cheat on exams? But you can use this technology not just for the exams, but you're saying, like, you can use it as a tool, as a learning tool. And I know that a lot of students have been using it to construct multiple choice questions for practicing. But I think the example you gave just now, which I haven't heard before, is actually really interesting. To use it to, again, practice, as you said, some high stakes conversations. As I have to try that out. I haven't seen it, but it sounds very, very intriguing.
I pretended to be the very struggling family member with a difficult situation, and pretending like I was giving it all the toughest emotional responses that a person normally would. And it was kind of acting like the doctor trying to counsel me off the ledge here. And the first one was like, that's a pretty good canned response. That's a pretty good standard phrase. How do you answer that situation? By the fifth or sixth thing I pushed it on, like, I think this is kind of counseling better than I do in real life at some point.
John, to your point, I mean, I think most of us have seen that paper that came out a little while ago in JAMA Internal Medicine. I think it was looking at responses to questions posed by patients on Reddit. But the ChatGPT responses, I believe, were rated fairly favorably, and actually might have been rated more empathetic, which I think might have been one of the more surprising findings of that paper. So I think the anecdote you're providing is certainly backed up by some literature. So perhaps counterintuitively.
I was going to say, you're all deeply embedded in the education system. Well, like with medical students and training, I mean, it caused some kind of crisis. I don't even know where it's at right now, but months ago, wasn't there, it's kind of a crisis associated, like, we have to ban this technology. Our students are not allowed to use it. We got to just go back to closed book exams because we don't know how to deal with this. I mean, what is happening now? What do you think it will and what should versus what should happen going forward?
The gut reaction is we have to ban on exams because, you know, our exams are not designed to test students reliably. What's the purpose of exams in medical school? Like, one of them is to see whether or not students are ready to move to the next level. Are they ready to start interacting with patients in a real clinical setting? One is to identify students that might need a little bit more support. And our exams, as they're currently designed, if students are going to use ChatGPT, it fails at the ability to do those things. Essentially, a failing student uses ChatGPT will no longer look like a failing student, and that's a problem. And so I think the two approaches would be, the two very extremes would be, one is, well, since ChatGPT ruins our exams, we just ban ChatGPT and pretend it doesn't exist and continue on our exams as we've always had, but just do it closed book now, or closed, we'd have an open book, but closed GPT. The other extreme would be, we're going to allow ChatGPT for all the exams because students are going to be using these in clinical settings, patients are going to be using them, the residents are going to be using them. So we just, use ChatGPT and we'll just figure out the exams as we go. But there's a large middle ground in there where we have to figure out how we can still have exams that are meaningful measures of student performance, while still allowing the students to use the same tools and resources they'll use when they get to the wards or when they get to the clinics. And if students are going to have access to ChatGPT on the wards and clinics, which they are going to have, we have to figure out how to make those exams still be accurate measures of their skills and performance. And I don't know, Alicia, what do you think about in terms of, obviously you're dealing with this because all the exams for the course for year 2 are now going to be closed book for this upcoming year.
Right. Well, I think first of all, we haven't figured out how to have it be closed GPT only. So the exams are just going to be completely closed, which I think is a bummer because that's not reflective of the practice of medicine when you have access and it's actually about gathering information and pulling information together to make decisions and determine what's next. The other thing I would just add is with what you said is that I think there's the issue of the fact that they're going to have AI on the ward. So how do we, assess that? But there's also how do we train for that? So I think it's kind of in my mind, it's always these two issues. It's the assessments, and then it's the curriculum and how are we going to adjust the curriculum to make sure that people are ready for the real world.
Yeah, that gets at some of the bias issues you had brought up earlier.
Right.
Can students recognize bias in a GPT answer or not? How do we teach them how to recognize bias or recognize the limitations
even more
of it?
basic than that, how do you ask it a question to get a refined answer, and then how can you adjust that question, and then how can you critique its output? What did it get wrong? What did it get right? What was missing? What follow-up questions would you ask? And so how do we train students to do that when we're working from square zero because we ourselves have not done this?
Yeah. In some cases, the students may know more about it than we do.
Exactly. That's why I think it has to be sort of an interactive curriculum where everyone's kind of involved in sharing with each other and teaching each other.
What do you think of the contrast of, on one, well, in real life, of course, I mean, our residents, let alone doctors, are using the tool already. They're using it on ICU rounds, I found out. I'm wow, really? Okay, you got to be careful. You got to understand what you're using it for. So better evaluate them given all the tools they would use in real life. On the flip side, when you're talking to a real life patient or family, you're supposed to just know what's in your head. You have to have that conversation on the spot. So there kind of is a closed book exam people have to be ready for in that conversation. Or I don't know, maybe Alicia, as a patient, how do you feel if the doc says, hang on a second, let me just type it. Okay, yes, what we're going to do is this plan. How would you feel about that?
Well, I feel good when a doctor says, actually, I don't know the answer to that question, so let me go and figure it out and come back and help you. I know that's a good doctor. That's somebody that I know is going to try to find the best care for me. But yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't want to have a, I guess though, there's two things. You don't want to have a student who's so reliant on AI that they don't know how to provide safe patient care. But you also don't want a student who doesn't know how to use it at all and then finds that everyone's using it. So I feel like it's a little bit of a catch-22 right now, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes.
Yeah, I think about it sort of like using calculators in math class. Like on one hand, like in your college calculus course, of course you can use calculators. Like that would be ridiculous to not allow a college level student to use a calculator. But my daughter's in 3rd grade learning arithmetic. She's not allowed to use calculators on her exams. Like at what point do you make the transition in math from not using calculators and learning the basic skills so that you can like figure out if you have enough change when you go to the grocery store to, oh, we're going to be using higher math. We don't need to worry about, addition and multiplication anymore. So we're going to let people use calculators at this point. I mean, I almost feel like it's the same idea where like you have to teach students like basic clinical reasoning skills, like basic, ability to figure out what questions to ask during an interview without using, additional tools, or else they're going to look like they have no idea what they're doing when they're interacting with the patient. But again, I don't know where's that transition point. I don't know. I don't know where it is for my kids' math courses, and I certainly don't know where it is for the students either, really.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, that we want the students to have some minimum level of unassisted competency, but where that cut point is, where they've graduated to being allowed to use chatbots is tougher. I mean, I think especially as the technology gets better, kind of going off what John was describing about like the ICU conversation, I think if anything, it makes all the the people-centered skills that we've always emphasized, like building rapport with patients and families, being able to deliver bad news in a compassionate way, navigating difficult goals of care conversations. If anything, it makes teaching those skills and mastering those skills even more important, because those are precisely the types of skills that I think are never going to get replaced, or at least I don't think are going to get replaced by a robot. Maybe I'm totally wrong. Maybe 10 years from now, when you're having the goals of care discussion, you send in a robot and it just, algorithmically goes through everything. So, maybe I'll that comment won't age well, but I like to think certain skills like that are more important than ever and not replaceable by bots.
It's kind of interesting, the idea like whether or not what a doctor or a clinician looks like is going to change with technology like generative, like if generative AI, whether or not it's ChatGPT, MedPalm, whatever, if it can perform better than an actual physician on making diagnoses, that makes making diagnoses no longer an important skill for a clinician to be good at, right? If the computer is going to be better than us then anyway, versus what you're bringing up, Jason, is like someone who's able to communicate well with the patients and having these empathetic conversations, and if those types of skills are going to be actually more important, unless you weigh really heavily on that Reddit study from a few months ago that showed that ChatGPT was actually more empathetic than doctors on Reddit. Then maybe we're just, I don't know, maybe we're just lost altogether.
I think but the issue is the AI doesn't actually know the context that the patient is living in. But I do think, with regard to what you're saying in the near, I think you're talking about like a long-term future, if an AI replaces the doctor in terms of making a diagnosis. But in the near term, I think it could help with a lot of the tasks that are weighing down doctors, and then give them more time for patient-facing activities that are so important, but other things get in the way, like documentation.
Yeah. I was not talking about a year from now.
Yeah.
25 years from now. But it's hard to tell with this technology. Like, who knows how fast it's going to go?
But GPT-5 could be out next year for all we know, right?
I think we'll all be in the unemployment line a year after that.
Except somebody's still going to have to teach people how to use it.
That's true.
Interpretive, lots of eliciting patient values and context and shared decision making. These are actually a very advanced skill we use all the time. We don't even realize we're doing it. It's just picking a diagnosis code from an ICD-10 code list, right? As a doctor, how many times I really wish I had a computer here which would pick the right ICD-10 code for me. I can't think of any time that's what I really wanted for. It was much more, man, how do I work with this patient, understand like their goals and their complexities and all the different factors? This is a really tense situation. How do I weigh the risk and benefits that, and what do they want versus what's capable? That requires a lot more weighing of different factors that there often is no direct answer in a lot of medicine. And it's being able to coordinate and manage a lot of that. I think there's plenty for us to do for the and unlimited demand for medical expertise that I'm not worried actually at all about doctors being replaced. On the flip side, I would say, I don't know, actually, Eric, I think you might be the oldest among us. Did you practice or did you train before the internet era? Because that was a huge disruption itself, right? I have no idea. I don't think you did, but at some point that was a shift, right? Where you used to memorize Harrison's or something. That was how you showed off. And now that's just, who cares now? It just doesn't make any sense to have that skill anymore. But now we have a different value that we need to bring to bear for patients.
Yeah, so thanks for bringing up my age, Jonathan. So I'd say I did not train before the internet, but I will say I trained before something that I think was more relevant for the practice of medicine. Is I trained before UpToDate. And I remember when UpToDate first came out, and it was actually just an online renal textbook with hypertext links. That was like the original version of UpToDate, and I remember that. And so we would have to carry around like all these paper books in our white coat pockets for reference. So I do remember that. And you're right though, because like as soon as UpToDate became ubiquitous, and as soon as people had devices that they could pull out and pull up drug doses and stuff, like the ability to memorize all these random things, no one cared anymore. All right. Well, what do you guys think is next? What's the next step? Where do we go from here? So we've shown that ChatGPT using GPT-4 can very, very barely outperform Stanford first and second year students on clinical reasoning, open free response exams. What's next? Like what do we go from here? Either our group or other people looking at the sort of the same space.
I mean, it's this very weird thing. I remember Jason Hom teaching me. He was my resident back in the day when I was an intern. You have to diagnose and you also empirically treat at the same time, right? You're planning where things are going and forecasting into the 5 to 10 year future. But in the meantime, you got to adapt to the present that's changing right in front of you. So right now we have access to the GPT-4 API within Stanford Healthcare, so it's safe for protected health information. And we're scrambling to figure out what are safe applications we could actually use this for to improve patient care or operations right now. Even though it's kind of ominous, right? A lot of this is moving faster than maybe we can test it as rigorously as we want to. So how do you maintain those like safety measures while realizing we're going to get left behind? The technology is moving so fast, and our patients and our doctors are already using them to some degree anyway. We got to figure out how to integrate them in a reliable way, let alone planning for all the future phases that are going to be changing the way we educate and I think re-educate an entire generation of physicians and patients.
Yeah, I think in the practice of medicine course, we have basically an immediate mandate to figure out, one, rewrite our assessments for a closed book format in time for an exam in December. And two, can we incorporate this, even if it's a 1 hour session? Can we start getting people thinking about how to judiciously use this type of technology?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's essential that we incorporate teaching ASAP. I mean, I think Alicia and Eric, you might have made the points about our students being potentially more tech savvy than we are, and I think that's very true. Alicia and I were on a call the other day where a student sent a bot to basically
meeting.
Yeah, to basically take notes and do things automatically in the meeting. We're like, oh, that's kind of interesting. So not something.
And the student was not there.
The student was not there, so it was like intended.
The student is at the bot, and it's as its surrogate.
Yes. So like, so we're just like, well, I mean, okay. So this is really this is, I guess, the new world.
I was going to piggyback on the fact that Jason is saying that, some of our students are more tech savvy than us, which is why I think as we're creating this curriculum, it'll be really important to actually have them on our committees and incorporate their voice and lift their ideas as we're designing the curriculum.
Ooh, that's an interesting, tense point that I've heard brought up at some of these education meetings that we've been to. It's like, wait a minute, unless you revamp the whole thing and rethink this, rather than sort of rewarding or recognizing the student who studies harder and really tries to learn something, eventually the tech savvy ones will start to score better and do better because they just know how to use tools better rather than them really studying and trying to integrate the knowledge themselves. So we'd better find a way to train up everybody in his technology skills to equalize that playing field. Otherwise, there's going to be rapidly exacerbated inequity along those frameworks. would be the one perspective that I think could be taken.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely an interesting conundrum, because that definitely could exacerbate inequities in among our students. But I agree with Alicia. Like, I think having student input is going to be really key to figuring out how to best incorporate this, because I think, for one thing, they think of a lot of ideas, a lot of use cases that we just don't think of, because they're the ones that are in the trenches, learning this material. And two, like, if they don't feel like that they have a voice in the process, of our development of a curriculum, I think they're going to be sort of less invested in how successful anything is that we come up with. And so I think it's going to be really, really key to making sure that they have a large voice and a large influence on where we go from here in terms of using this technology in the classroom and in assessments and ultimately with our patients. So thanks you guys for joining us. This was actually a really not just great discussion, but this has actually been a great project that we've been working on now for six months now. It's been that we've been doing this since I think Alicia and I first exchanged some emails right around New Year's with this idea. So thanks for being a part of it and making it happen.
Thank you.
Absolutely. No.